Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where ordinary roads become portals and true horror lurks behind every curve. Tonight we're traveling a haunted highway where drivers report shadow figures pacing the lane, phantom hitchhikers vanishing at dawn, and strange knocks under the chassis as if something clings beneath. These aren't random tales. They're legends passed through generations and real accounts from travelers who swore they'd never speak of it again. If you're curious, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ghostly mile. Now settle in. The asphalt stretches ahead, the wind picks up, and the story is about to take the wheel. Story 1. Echo of the Grateful Dead show. I found the cassette tape wedged between the seat cushions of my rig on a Tuesday morning in Bakersfield. Someone had scrawled, "Dead Show, 77 Cornell," across the faded label in ballpoint pen. The previous driver must have left it behind when he quit without notice last month. Management said he just walked away from a full load in Nevada, left the keys in the ignition and disappeared into the desert. They never found him. The tape should have been my first warning. I had been driving trucks for 15 years, hauling everything from furniture to farm equipment across the western states. This particular run was different though. I was transporting sound equipment for some indie band, tour, speakers, amplifiers, mixing boards. The whole setup. The kind of gear that costs more than most people's houses. The load was heading from Los Angeles to Portland, a straight shot up Interstate 5 that I had driven hundreds of times before. But something felt wrong from the moment I pulled out of the warehouse. The shadows seemed longer than they should have been for 10 in the morning. The other drivers at the truck stop avoided eye contact when I stopped for fuel. Even my CB radio crackled with strange interference, voices speaking in languages I could not identify. By the time I reached the Grapevine, that notorious mountain pass north of LA where trucks crawl up steep grades and brakes fail on the way down, I was ready for some music to calm my nerves. I reached for my usual collection of country CDs, but my hand found the mysterious cassette instead. The plastic case felt unnaturally cold against my fingers, like it had been sitting in a freezer instead of a sun-baked truck cab. I slipped the tape into my ancient stereo system. The music that emerged was not what I expected. The recording quality was poor, full of hiss and static, but underneath the noise I could hear the unmistakable sound of the Grateful Dead in their prime. Jerry Garcia's guitar work floated through the speakers like liquid mercury, while Phil Lesh's bass lines seemed to vibrate through the very frame of my truck. The crowd noise was distant but enthusiastic. Thousands of voices singing along to "Fire on the Mountain." That was when I first noticed the shadows. At first I thought it was just the mountain curves playing tricks with the afternoon sunlight. But as I watched my rearview mirrors, the shadows inside my cab began moving independently of any external light source. They swayed and danced in rhythm with the music, like invisible concertgoers caught up in the groove. The hair on my arms stood up as a chill ran down my spine despite the blazing California heat outside. I turned off the tape player, but the shadows kept dancing. The music continued playing even though the stereo was silent. Jerry's guitar solo echoed faintly from somewhere behind me, among the stacked equipment in my trailer. I pulled over at the next rest stop, my hands shaking as I set the parking brake. The sudden silence when I turned off the engine was deafening. I climbed back to check my load, flashlight in hand even though it was still daylight. Everything was secured properly, the equipment strapped down tight and covered with tarps. But as I stood there in the dim trailer space, I caught the unmistakable smell of patchouli incense and marijuana smoke drifting through the air. The scent was so strong it made my eyes water. That was impossible. I had never smoked anything stronger than cigarettes, and this equipment had come straight from a sterile warehouse. Yet the smell persisted, growing stronger as I moved deeper into the trailer. Mixed with the hippie aromas was something else, something organic and unpleasant. Like body odor and unwashed hair, the smell of people who had been living rough for too long. I backed out of the trailer quickly and slammed the doors shut. Back in my cab, I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe the previous driver had been a deadhead who had spilled something that left a lingering smell. Maybe the mountain altitude was affecting my brain chemistry. Maybe I just needed some strong coffee and a good meal. But when I turned the key to restart my engine, my CB radio crackled to life without me touching the controls. "Hey now, keep it between the lines, man." The voice was warm and friendly, with that distinctive laid-back California drawl that Jerry Garcia had been famous for. But Jerry Garcia had been dead for over 25 years. I grabbed the microphone with trembling fingers. "Who is this? Come back." Nothing but static answered me. I merged back onto Interstate 5 with my heart pounding against my ribs. The late afternoon sun was painting the mountains in shades of orange and red, but inside my cab the shadows had grown longer and darker. They moved like they were alive, reaching across my dashboard and climbing up the walls. In my peripheral vision I could swear I saw human shapes among them, figures with long hair and tie-dyed clothing nodding their heads to music I could no longer hear. The next 50 miles passed in a blur of paranoia and mounting dread. Every time I glanced in my mirrors, the shadows seemed more solid, more defined. I began to make out individual faces among them, hollow-eyed and gaunt, with the desperate look of people who had followed the Dead tour for too many years and lost themselves along the way. They watched me drive with expressions of infinite sadness and longing. As darkness fell over the Central Valley, my CB radio began picking up fragments of conversation that made no sense. Voices discussing shows from decades past, arguing about setlists and bootleg recordings, sharing stories about legendary concerts that had passed into folklore. But underneath their words was an urgency, a desperation that suggested these were not just nostalgic reminiscences. The music never stopped, man. It just moved on without us. Been riding these highways since '95, looking for that perfect show. Jerry, still out there somewhere. You just gotta know where to listen. I tried changing channels, but every frequency carried the same ghostly conversations. The voices grew more insistent as the miles passed, pleading with me to understand something I could not grasp. They spoke of being trapped between worlds, caught in the space between life and death by their obsession with following the band. That was when I realized I was no longer alone in my cab. The passenger seat that had been empty all day now held the outline of a human figure. Not solid flesh and blood, but a presence I could sense more than see. Long hair, worn denim jacket, the faint outline of a skull and roses t-shirt. The figure turned toward me, and though I could not make out distinct features, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical force. "You got something that belongs to us," the presence whispered, its voice coming from inside my own head rather than through my ears. "That tape you found? It is more than just music, brother." I wanted to pull over, to stop the truck and run screaming into the night. But my hand seemed frozen to the steering wheel, my foot pressed to the accelerator by some force beyond my control. The speedometer climbed past 70, past 80, faster than any loaded truck should safely travel on a dark highway. "The Cornell show was special," the voice continued. "May 8th, 1977. Some say it was the greatest performance Jerry ever gave. The music that night was so pure, so perfect, that it opened doors between worlds. Those of us who were there, really there in spirit, we got caught in the echo." In my mirrors, I could see my trailer swaying dangerously as I took curves too fast. The weight of the sound equipment was shifting despite the tie-downs, threatening to jackknife the entire rig. But I could not slow down. Something was driving me forward, pulling me toward a destination I did not understand. We've been following that music ever since," the ghostly passenger explained. "Riding the highways, searching for a way back to that perfect moment. But we need a guide, someone still alive who can carry us there." The terrible truth began to dawn on me. The previous driver who had abandoned his truck in Nevada had not quit his job. He had been chosen, just like I was being chosen now. The cassette tape was not just a recording, it was a trap, a lure designed to catch living souls and bind them to the endless tour of the dead. "Don, to fight it, man," the presence urged as my speedometer pushed past 90. "Let the music take you where it wants to go. There are worse ways to spend eternity than following Jerry through the cosmic highway." But I was not ready to join their phantom caravan. With enormous effort, I forced my foot onto the brake pedal. The truck began to slow, its air brakes hissing like angry serpents. The shadows in my cab writhed and twisted as if in pain, and the ghostly passenger let out a wail of frustration that seemed to come from dimensions beyond human comprehension. I pulled into the next truck stop, my entire body shaking with exhaustion and terror. The moment I turned off the engine, the presence vanished. The shadows returned to their normal, inanimate state. The CB radio fell silent except for occasional chatter from other drivers discussing traffic conditions and fuel prices. But the cassette tape was still there, sitting on my dashboard like an accusation. I should have destroyed it then. Should have thrown it into the nearest dumpster or crushed it under my boot heel. Instead, I found myself picking it up, studying the faded handwriting on the label. Part of me wanted to play it again, to hear that perfect music and let it carry me away from all the loneliness and responsibility of my ordinary life. That was how they got you? The deadheads knew that everyone carried some emptiness inside, some longing for something more meaningful than just hauling freight from one city to another. They offered eternal music, an endless tour where the shows never ended and the community never disbanded. All you had to do was let go of your attachment to the living world. I walked into the truck stop restaurant and ordered coffee and pie, trying to ground myself in mundane reality. The waitress was middle-aged and tired, refilling coffee cups for truckers who all looked as worn down as I felt. Normal people living normal lives, unaware of the supernatural highways that ran parallel to the interstates they traveled. When I returned to my truck 2 hours later, I found a note tucked under my windshield wiper. The paper was yellowed with age, and the handwriting was the same as on the cassette label. The music never stops. You can delay the journey, but you cannot avoid it. I'll be waiting for you at the next show, brother. Keep on trucking. I drove straight through to Portland without stopping again, delivered my load of sound equipment, and collected my payment. But I kept the cassette tape. Some part of me could not let it go, even knowing the danger it represented. It sat on my dashboard during every subsequent run, a constant reminder of how thin the barrier was between our world and whatever lay beyond. Over the following months, I heard stories from other drivers about strange experiences on the highways. Phantom hitchhikers wearing tie-dyed clothing who vanished when you stopped to pick them up. CB radio transmissions of concerts that had ended decades ago. Trucks found abandoned with their stereos playing bootleg recordings of dead shows, their drivers never seen again. The epidemic was spreading. More souls were joining the eternal tour every week. I finally understood what had happened to my predecessor, and I knew it was only a matter of time before I followed him into whatever dimension the ghostly deadheads inhabited. The music was patient, but it was also persistent. Every night when I parked my truck and tried to sleep, I could hear Jerry, his guitar calling to me from just beyond the edge of perception. Last week, I made a decision. I recorded this account and mailed it to my sister, along with instructions to destroy the cassette tape if anything happens to me. But I know she will not be able to do it. The music has a way of protecting itself, of finding new carriers to spread its influence. Tonight I am parked at a rest stop in Arizona, watching the desert stars and waiting for the inevitable. The shadows in my cab are dancing again, and I can smell patchouli drifting on the night breeze. My CB radio is picking up fragments of Truckin', played by a band that died before most of my listeners were born. The passenger seat is no longer empty. Ready for the show, brother? The familiar presence asks, Jerry, it's been waiting for you. The music never stopped. It just moved on to a different stage. My hand reaches for the ignition key one last time. In a few minutes, another driver will find my truck abandoned on the side of the highway. My logbook scattered on the ground and my stereo playing a bootleg recording of the Cornell show from May 8, 1977. But I will finally be where the music never ends. Story 2. Coffin That Beats Like a Heart. I hauled a coffin across 3 states, and for 800 miles, it beat in perfect rhythm with my heart. My name is Frank Morrison, and I have been driving freight for 19 years. I thought I had seen every kind of cargo you could imagine. Auto parts, livestock, hazardous chemicals, even a few loads I preferred not to ask questions about. But nothing prepared me for the job that came through my dispatcher on a rainy Thursday in October. The pay was too good to be real. $5,000 for a single-day run from Salem, Oregon to a private estate outside Reno, Nevada. One item, special handling required, no questions asked. The client had specifically requested an experienced driver with a clean record and no history of cargo inspection violations. I should have known something was wrong when I saw the pickup location. Whitmore & Sons Funeral Home sat on a dead-end street in the old part of Salem, surrounded by Victorian houses that had been converted into law offices and insurance agencies. The building looked like it had been there since the 1800s, all Gothic stonework and stained glass windows that cast colored shadows across the parking lot. The funeral director who met me was ancient, maybe 80 years old, with paper-thin skin and eyes like chips of black ice. He led me around to the loading dock without saying a word, just pointing with a skeletal finger toward a cargo van that was already backed up to the platform. That is where I saw the coffin. It was not like any funeral casket I had ever encountered. This thing was old, maybe centuries old, carved from black wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was covered with symbols I did not recognize, flowing script that looked like it had been etched by hand rather than machine. Iron bands wrapped around the entire length, secured with locks that looked medieval. The funeral director handed me a sealed envelope and a key ring with 3 different keys. His voice was barely above a whisper when he explained the job. Transport the coffin to the Blackwood estate outside Reno. Deliver it to the loading dock. Do not open the cargo area during transport. Do not inspect the contents. Do not ask questions about the client or the cargo. Most importantly, do not open the coffin under any circumstances. I loaded the coffin into my trailer using a hydraulic lift. The thing was incredibly heavy, maybe 800 pounds, like it was filled with concrete rather than human remains. It took up most of the cargo space in my 24-foot box truck, secured with heavy straps and padding to prevent movement during transport. I started driving south on Interstate 5 around noon. The weather was typical for October in Oregon, overcast and drizzling, the kind of gray day that makes you want to stay in bed. The truck handled normally despite the heavy cargo, and I settled into the rhythm of long-distance driving. That is when I first heard the sound. It started about an hour outside of Salem, just as I was climbing through the mountains toward the California border. A soft, rhythmic thumping from the cargo area. At first, I thought it was just the coffin shifting slightly as we hit bumps in the road. But the sound was too regular, too deliberate. Thump, 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 like a heartbeat. I pulled over at a rest stop and walked around to the back of the truck. The cargo area was locked, just as the funeral director had instructed, but I could hear the sound more clearly now. It was definitely coming from inside the coffin, a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to pulse with organic regularity. I pressed my ear against the truck door and listened. The thumping was unmistakable, and it seemed to be getting stronger. But more disturbing was the realization that the rhythm matched my own pulse. When my heart rate increased from the adrenaline of discovering the sound, the thumping from the coffin increased as well. I climbed back into the cab and continued driving south, but I could not stop thinking about what I had heard. Dead bodies do not have heartbeats. Corpses do not move or make sounds. Whatever was in that coffin, it was not a typical funeral transport. The sound continued through the afternoon as I drove through Northern California. Sometimes it was barely audible, just a whisper of movement from the cargo area. Other times it was so loud I could hear it over the engine noise and road sounds. But it never stopped completely, and it never broke from that steady, rhythmic pattern. Thump, thump, thump. I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe the coffin contained some kind of mechanical device. Maybe it was a prop for a movie or theater production. Maybe the client was an eccentric collector who enjoyed elaborate pranks. But deep down, I knew I was trying to convince myself of lies. The sound was organic. It was alive, and it was synchronized with my own biological rhythms in a way that defied explanation. By evening, I was driving through the Sierra Nevada mountains, winding through narrow passes with steep drops on both sides. The thumping from the coffin had become constant now. No longer just occasional bumps, but a steady percussion that seemed to vibrate through the entire truck. I could feel it in the steering wheel. I could feel it in the seat. The whole vehicle was pulsing with the rhythm of whatever was inside that antique wooden box. I stopped for fuel at a truck stop outside Truckee and tried calling my dispatcher. The phone went straight to voicemail. I tried calling the funeral home in Salem, but their number was disconnected. Even the client contact information led to a recording saying the number was no longer in service. I was alone on a mountain highway with a cargo I did not understand, carrying something that should have been dead but was clearly, impossibly alive. The final stretch to Reno took me through some of the most desolate country in Nevada. Empty desert punctuated by rocky hills and dried lake beds. No traffic, no lights, just endless darkness under a sky full of stars. The perfect place for something terrible to happen without witnesses. The thumping from the coffin was so loud now that I had to turn up my radio just to hear music over the sound. But even worse was the way it was affecting me physically. My own heartbeat was being pulled into synchronization with whatever was inside that box. When the thumping slowed down, my pulse slowed with it. When it accelerated, my heart raced to match. I was losing control of my own body, becoming a slave to the rhythm of the thing I was transporting. The Blackwood estate sat at the end of a long dirt road, maybe 10 miles off the main highway. The property was surrounded by a 12-foot iron fence topped with razor wire. Security cameras tracked my approach from hidden positions among the sagebrush and Joshua trees. This was not the home of an antique collector. This was a fortress. The main house was invisible from the road, hidden behind hills and stands of pine trees. But the loading dock was right at the entrance, a concrete platform with industrial lighting and hydraulic equipment. A man in an expensive suit was waiting for me when I arrived. He did not introduce himself or ask for identification. He just handed me an envelope full of cash and pointed toward the platform where I should unload the coffin. His eyes never met mine, and he stayed as far away from the truck as possible while still supervising the delivery. The coffin was even heavier when I unloaded it, like the contents had somehow gained mass during the trip. It took both of us and a mechanical lift to move it onto the platform. The whole time, the thumping continued, now so loud that both of us could hear it clearly. The man in the suit did not seem surprised by the sound. If anything, he looked relieved, like the noise confirmed that his expensive cargo had survived the journey intact. He signed a receipt and disappeared into the darkness without another word. I drove away from the Blackwood estate as quickly as possible, but something had changed during the delivery. The silence in my truck was absolute now. No more thumping, no more rhythmic vibration. But my own heart felt wrong, like it was struggling to maintain a normal beat without the external rhythm to guide it. I made it about 50 miles before I had to pull over. My chest felt tight, and my pulse was erratic, skipping beats and then racing to catch up. I sat in the cab of my truck on the shoulder of a dark Nevada highway, wondering if I was having a heart attack. The attack passed after about 20 minutes, but the feeling of wrongness remained. Something had been taken from me during that delivery, some essential rhythm that had kept my body functioning normally. I felt like a clock with a broken mainspring, still ticking but losing time with every beat. I drove straight home to Portland and saw a doctor the next morning. The EKG showed an irregular heartbeat, arrhythmia that had no apparent cause. My heart was physically healthy, but it was beating to a pattern that made no medical sense. The doctor prescribed medication and recommended a specialist, but the test showed nothing abnormal. I tried to research the Blackwood estate and the client who had hired me for the delivery. No public records existed for the property. No business licenses or corporate filings mentioned the name. Even the address I had delivered to did not appear on any maps or GPS systems. It was like the place had been erased from official existence. The funeral home in Salem was more mysterious. Whitmore and Sons had been in business for over a century, but their recent records were sealed or missing. I found newspaper articles from the 1920s describing strange incidents connected to the business. Unexplained deaths, missing bodies, accusations of occult practices that were never proven in court. But the most disturbing discovery came when I researched the symptoms I was experiencing. Cardiac arrhythmia synchronized to external rhythms was a known phenomenon, but only in extreme cases of psychological trauma or paranormal exposure. The medical literature described it as sympathetic resonance, a condition where the heart adopts the rhythm of a more powerful biological signal. In other words, my heart was still trying to beat in time with whatever had been inside that coffin, even though we were now hundreds of miles apart. I found 3 other drivers who had transported similar cargo for the same client. All of them had developed heart problems after their deliveries. 2 had died within a year of mysterious cardiac events that doctors could not explain. The third was in a care facility, his heart beating so slowly that he was barely conscious most of the time. The pattern was clear. The coffin contained something that fed on human cardiac rhythm, using drivers as unwilling donors to maintain its own artificial life. Each transport weakened the driver and strengthened whatever was sealed inside that antique wooden box. I tried to warn other drivers through CB radio and trucking forums, but my story sounded crazy even to me. Who would believe that a coffin could steal your heartbeat? Who would accept that some kind of parasitic entity was using the freight system to move around the country, feeding on the life force of anyone who got too close? The medication helped stabilize my heart rhythm, but it could not fix the fundamental damage. I was living on borrowed time, my cardiovascular system slowly failing as it tried to maintain a beat that belonged to something else. Something that was probably still alive in that estate outside Reno, growing stronger with every pulse it had stolen from me. I stopped driving long-distance freight and took a local job delivering supplies to construction sites. But even short trips triggered episodes of arrhythmia, like my heart remembered the rhythm of the coffin and tried to return to that synchronized state. I was becoming a walking reminder of the thing I had transported, a biological echo of its presence. The final piece of the puzzle came from an old newspaper article one found in the Portland Library archives. A story from 1897 about a wealthy industrialist named Marcus Blackwood who had died under mysterious circumstances. According to the report, Blackwood had been experimenting with life extension techniques based on ancient European folklore. His theory was that consciousness could be preserved indefinitely by maintaining cardiac rhythm through external sources. He had built a device that could synchronize his heartbeat with the hearts of other people, essentially using them as biological batteries to power his continued existence. The experiment had apparently succeeded. Blackwood had died physically, but his consciousness had been transferred to the device, allowing him to continue existing as long as he had access to living hearts to sustain the rhythm. His estate had been using freight drivers to transport the device around the country for over a century, feeding on their cardiac energy to maintain his artificial immortality. I was not just a truck driver who had delivered strange cargo. I was a victim of a century-old vampire who fed on heartbeats instead of blood, a creature that had found the perfect hunting ground in the anonymous world of long-distance freight transport. My heart is failing now. The medication can only do so much to compensate for the essential rhythm that was stolen from me during that delivery. I have maybe 6 months before the arrhythmia becomes fatal. Another casualty of Marcus Blackwood's hunger for continued existence. But I am not going quietly. I have documented everything I learned about the coffin shipments in the Blackwood estate. I have contacted families of the other drivers who died after similar deliveries. I have tried to warn every freight company in the western states about the client who pays too much for simple transport jobs. The thing in that coffin is still out there, still hiring drivers to move it around the country, still feeding on the cardiac rhythms of anyone foolish enough to accept the job. It has been doing this for over a century, leaving a trail of unexplained heart attacks and mysterious deaths across America. If you drive freight, especially if you get offered a high-paying job to transport antique funeral items, remember this story. Remember that some cargo is more dangerous than explosives or toxic chemicals. Some loads will kill you slowly, one heartbeat at a time, while you drive unknowingly toward your own death. The coffin is still traveling America's highways, hidden in the back of trucks driven by men who do not know they are carrying their own doom. And Marcus Blackwood is still alive inside that wooden box, sustained by stolen heartbeats, waiting patiently for the next driver who needs money badly enough to transport the impossible. Listen to your heart while you still can, because once it starts beating to someone else, this rhythm, it might never beat for you again. The road between life and death runs both ways, and sometimes the cargo you carry follows you home. Story 3. Dead Man. This tattoo I gave a ride to a man who had been dead for 3 weeks, and I did not realize it until I saw his picture on the evening news. My name is Tommy Walsh, and I have been driving 18-wheelers across America for 15 years. In all that time, I picked up exactly one hitchhiker. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was not asking enough questions about the distinctive snake tattoo wrapped around his left forearm. The third mistake was believing he was alive. It happened on a Tuesday night in late September, somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque on Interstate 40. I was hauling auto parts from Phoenix to a plant in Oklahoma City, running behind schedule because of a breakdown outside of Kingman. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, nothing but scrub brush and rock formations under a sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. That is when I saw him standing on the shoulder, thumb out, backpack slung over one shoulder. He was maybe 35 years old, average height and build, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. Nothing unusual about him except for the location. You do not see many hitchhikers in the middle of the Arizona desert at 11 o'clock at night. I almost drove past him. Company policy strictly forbade picking up hitchhikers, and I had never broken that rule in 15 years of driving. But something about the guy made me hit the air brakes and pull over. Maybe it was the fact that he was alone in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town. Maybe it was the way he stood patiently with his thumb out, not desperately flagging down every vehicle like most hitchhikers do. Or maybe it was because I was lonely after 14 hours of driving through empty desert, and I wanted someone to talk to for the next few hundred miles. He climbed into the passenger seat with a grateful smile and introduced himself as Marcus. No last name, just Marcus. He had a firm handshake and looked me straight in the eye when he thanked me for stopping. His voice was clear and friendly, with a slight accent I could not place. Maybe Texas, maybe Oklahoma, somewhere in the Southwest. We talked for hours as I drove through the night. Marcus was easy to talk to. One of those people who can carry on a conversation about anything. He asked about life on the road, about the places I had been, about the cargo I was hauling. Nothing too personal or intrusive, just the kind of casual conversation you have with a stranger who seems genuinely interested in your life. He told me he was traveling to visit family in New Mexico, that he had been on the road for a few weeks working odd jobs and moving from town to town. Said he preferred hitchhiking to taking buses because you met more interesting people and saw more of the real America. He had stories about other rides he had caught, other drivers who had picked him up, other adventures along the highways of the Southwest. That is when I noticed the tattoo. It was wrapped around his left forearm like a living thing, a detailed snake with scales so realistic they seemed to shimmer in the dashboard lights. The snake, its body coiled from his wrist to his elbow, and its head was positioned on the back of his hand, mouth open to show fangs that looked like they could inject real venom. The artwork was incredible, professional quality with shading and color that must have taken dozens of hours to complete. I complimented him on the tattoo, and Marcus rolled up his sleeve to show me more detail. The snake was a diamondback rattlesnake, he said, done by an artist in Tucson who specialized in Southwest wildlife. He had gotten it to commemorate a close call with a real rattler during a camping trip in the Sonoran Desert. The snake had struck at him but missed, and he decided to honor the encounter with permanent ink. The story made sense, and the tattoo was genuinely impressive, but something about it bothered me, though I could not put my finger on what. Maybe it was the way the snake seemed to move slightly when Marcus gestured with his hand. Maybe it was how the colors seemed too bright, too vivid, like fresh ink, even though he claimed it was several years old. We reached the outskirts of Albuquerque around 4 in the morning. Marcus asked me to drop him off at a truck stop near the interstate, said he could catch another ride from there to wherever he was headed. I pulled into the parking lot and let him out, wishing him luck on the rest of his journey. He thanked me again for the ride and the conversation, said it had been one of the most pleasant trips he had taken in years. Then he shouldered his backpack and walked into the truck stop, just another traveler moving through the night on the endless highways of America. I fueled up and grabbed coffee, then continued east toward Oklahoma. The cab felt empty without Marcus, and I found myself missing our conversation. He had been good company, someone who understood the appeal of the open road and the freedom of constant movement. I hoped he found his family and whatever he was looking for in New Mexico. 3 days later, I was back home in Tulsa, unloading my trailer and catching up on paperwork. That evening, I was watching the local news when a story caught my attention. A body had been found in the desert outside of Flagstaff, Arizona. The victim was a 35-year-old man who had been murdered approximately 3 weeks earlier. The reporter said the victim appeared to be a transient or hitchhiker, based on the backpack and camping gear found with the body. Police were asking for the public's help in identifying the man, who had no identification or wallet when he was discovered. Then they showed his picture. My blood turned to ice water. The face on the screen was Marcus, the hitchhiker I had picked up 3 nights earlier. Same features, same build, same age. But according to the news report, this man had been dead for 3 weeks, killed around the same time I had been driving through Arizona on a different run. I stared at the television screen, trying to process what I was seeing. The reporter continued with more details about the investigation. The victim had been shot twice in the chest and left in a remote area of desert about 50 miles from where I had picked up Marcus. Animals and exposure had complicated the investigation, but the medical examiner estimated he had been dead for at least 20 days. But the detail that made me start shaking was the tattoo. The news report mentioned that the victim had a distinctive snake tattoo on his left forearm, a detailed diamondback rattlesnake that police hoped would help with identification. Anyone who had seen a man with this specific tattoo was urged to contact authorities immediately. I had not just seen the tattoo, I had ridden with it for 6 hours, admiring the artwork and listening to the story of how Marcus had gotten it. I had watched it seem to move in the dashboard lights as we drove through the desert night. I had shaken the hand that bore the snake, his head, feeling warm flesh and strong grip. But according to the medical examiner, that hand had been decomposing in the Arizona desert for 3 weeks. I called the police number shown on the screen and tried to explain what had happened. The detective who took my call was professional but skeptical. He listened to my story about picking up a hitchhiker who matched the description of the murder victim, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "How do you explain to a law enforcement officer that you gave a ride to a dead man?" The detective asked me to come to the station and give a formal statement. I drove to Flagstaff the next day and met with the investigative team handling the case. They showed me more photos of the victim, including close-ups of the snake tattoo. There was no doubt about it. The man I had picked up was the same person whose body had been decomposing in the desert. But the timeline made my story impossible. The victim had been killed on September 5th, according to forensic evidence. I had picked up Marcus on September 28th, 23 days later. Even if the medical examiner was wrong about the time of death, which was unlikely given the condition of the body, there was no way the victim could have been alive and hitchhiking weeks after being shot twice in the chest. The detectives were polite, but obviously thought I was either lying or suffering from some kind of psychological episode. They suggested I might have seen the victim before his death, perhaps on an earlier trip through the area, and confused the timing in my memory. Stress and fatigue from long-distance driving could cause false memories and temporal displacement, they said. But I knew what I had experienced. I had spent 6 hours in close quarters with Marcus, talking and laughing and sharing stories. I had felt his presence in the cab, heard his voice, watched him gesture with hands that should have been bones and dust in the desert. There was no confusion or false memory involved. I had given a ride to a man who was already dead. I started researching similar cases online, looking for other reports of encounters with deceased hitchhikers. What I found was a pattern of stories going back decades, always following the same basic structure. Drivers would pick up hitchhikers who seemed normal and alive, only to discover later that their passengers had died weeks, months, or even years earlier. The stories came from all over America, but they were particularly common in the Southwest desert regions. Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and parts of Texas and California. Places where people disappeared into vast empty spaces and their bodies might not be found for months or years. Places where the boundary between life and death seemed thinner than elsewhere. Most of the drivers who reported these encounters were long-haul truckers, people who spent their lives moving through the lonely spaces between cities. They picked up hitchhikers who were polite and conversational, who told believable stories about their travels and destinations. Only later did they discover that their passengers had been victims of murder, accident, or exposure in the very areas where they were picked up. The common thread in all these stories was isolation. Both the drivers and the hitchhikers were people who existed on the margins of society, moving through spaces that most Americans never saw. The drivers were tired and lonely, vulnerable to the kind of psychological manipulation that might allow a dead person to seem alive. The hitchhikers were people who had died alone and unnoticed, whose spirits might be desperate enough to continue their interrupted journeys by any means possible. I found a research paper by a folklore professor at Arizona State University who had been studying these encounters for over 20 years. According to her analysis, the phenomenon was most common along routes that followed old Native American trading paths and migration corridors. The highways that crossed the Southwest were built on top of trails that had been used for thousands of years, paths that connected distant communities across vast desert spaces. The professor's theory was that certain locations accumulated psychic energy from centuries of human passage, creating thin spots in reality where the boundary between past and present became permeable. When someone died violently or suddenly in these areas, their spirit might become trapped in the endless cycle of movement that characterized the location. They continued hitchhiking even after death, seeking rides from drivers who were tired or lonely enough to perceive them as living passengers. The encounters were not malicious, just desperate attempts by lost souls to complete journeys that had been interrupted by tragedy. The theory sounded crazy, but it explained details that skeptics could not account for. Why did the ghost hitchhikers always seem so normal and alive? Because they were drawing energy from the drivers who picked them up, borrowing life force to maintain the illusion of physical existence. Why did the encounters always happen at night on lonely stretches of highway? Because those were the conditions when drivers were most vulnerable to supernatural manipulation. Why did the ghosts always have distinctive features like tattoos or scars? Because they were using the strongest memories from their lives to construct their temporary physical forms, focusing on details that had been important to their identity when they were alive. I realized that Marcus had been feeding on my loneliness and fatigue during our 6-hour ride together. He had seemed so real because he was using my own life energy to sustain the illusion of being alive. The more we talked, the more solid he became, until I was completely convinced that I was riding with a living person instead of a restless spirit. But the energy exchange had not been one way. I had been drained by the encounter, left feeling empty and exhausted in a way that went beyond normal road fatigue. For days after dropping off Marcus, I felt like something essential had been taken from me. My sleep was disrupted by dreams of desert highways and coiling snakes. My waking hours were haunted by the memory of conversations with a man who should not have existed. I never picked up another hitchhiker. I changed my route to avoid the stretch of highway where I had encountered Marcus, taking longer paths that kept me on busier roads with more traffic and lights. I installed a dashboard camera in my cab and started keeping detailed logs of my trips, documenting everything I saw and experienced as protection against future supernatural manipulation. But I could not shake the feeling that Marcus was still out there, still standing on the shoulder of Interstate 40 with his thumb out and his backpack ready. Still looking for rides from drivers who were tired enough and lonely enough to believe that death was not the end of the journey. The detective in Flagstaff called me 6 months later with an update on the case. They had identified the murder victim as Marcus Rodriguez, a 35-year-old construction worker from El Paso who had been traveling to Albuquerque to visit his sister. He had been killed during a robbery attempt that went wrong, shot by two men who were later arrested for a series of similar crimes across the Southwest. The case was closed, but the detective wanted to follow up on my statement about picking up the victim weeks after his death. He had been thinking about our conversation and wanted to know if I had any additional details that might help explain the discrepancy in timing. I told him the truth, that I believed I had encountered the spirit of Marcus Rodriguez, that the man had been using supernatural means to continue his interrupted journey. The detective listened politely and thanked me for my time, but I could tell he thought I was delusional. But just before he hung up, he mentioned something that made my blood run cold. 3 other drivers had contacted the police with similar stories about picking up hitchhikers who matched Marcus Rodriguez's description. All of them had encountered him on the same stretch of highway where I had stopped, and all of them had noticed the distinctive snake tattoo. All of them had given rides to a man who had been dead for weeks. Marcus Rodriguez never made it to Albuquerque to visit his sister, but his spirit is still trying to complete that journey, one ride at a time, using the loneliness and compassion of long-haul drivers to sustain his desperate attempt to reach a destination he will never see. If you drive the highways of the Southwest late at night, if you see a lone figure with his thumb out standing in the desert darkness, remember this story. Remember that some passengers are more than they appear, and some journeys continue long after death has ended the traveler's life. The road between the living and the dead runs both ways, and sometimes the people we try to help are beyond any assistance we can provide. But they keep trying anyway, standing patiently on the shoulder of America's loneliest highways, hoping that the next driver who stops will be kind enough to give a dead man one more ride toward home. Story 4. Water hauler. This burden, the drowning dream, started the moment I picked up the load in Bakersfield. 40,000 gallons of municipal water in my tanker trailer, bound for emergency delivery to drought-stricken Fresno County. The paperwork said it was pumped from Lake Isabella, a massive reservoir in the southern Sierra Nevada mountains. What the paperwork did not mention was why I kept seeing faces beneath the surface every time I closed my eyes. I had been hauling liquids for 12 years, everything from milk to motor oil to liquid fertilizer. Water was supposed to be the easiest cargo, clean and odorless and legally safe to transport without hazmat certification. But something felt wrong about this particular load from the moment I connected my air hoses and pulled out of the depot. The trailer seemed to move differently, swaying and rolling as if the water inside was alive and restless. A full tanker should ride steady and smooth, the liquid forming a solid mass that barely shifts during normal driving. But even on straight highway stretches, I could feel the cargo sloshing back and forth like it was only half full. The sensation made my stomach queasy and forced me to drive slower than usual, fighting to maintain control as unexpected surges of liquid weight threw my rig off balance. By the time I reached the mountains, I was having trouble staying awake. The dreams came every time I blinked or let my concentration wander for even a moment. Visions of being underwater, surrounded by murky green darkness that pressed against my lungs like a living thing. I would see buildings beneath the surface, houses and stores and churches covered in algae and populated by fish that swam through broken windows. Streets that led nowhere, overgrown with aquatic weeds and littered with the bones of automobiles from the 1920s. In the dreams, I was drowning slowly, my mouth and nose filling with lake water that tasted of decay and forgotten time. But I was not alone in the depths. Other figures moved through the submerged landscape, reaching out with waterlogged fingers and opening their mouths to release streams of silver bubbles that carried whispered words I could not understand. I pulled into a truck stop near Tehachapi to splash cold water on my face and drink enough coffee to keep my eyes open. But when I looked in the bathroom mirror, I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. My reflection looked like it was underwater, distorted by ripples and green with algae. When I blinked, the image cleared, but I could swear I saw tiny fish swimming behind my eyes. Back at my truck, I walked around the tanker trailer to check for leaks or damage. The stainless steel surface was dry and unmarked, but when I pressed my ear against the metal, I could hear sounds that water should not make. Voices, muffled and distant, speaking in languages that predated English. The sound of church bells ringing beneath tons of liquid weight. Children calling for their mothers with words that dissolved into bubbles before they could reach the surface. I climbed back into my cab and tried to radio my dispatcher for permission to dump the load and return empty. But my CB picked up only static, punctuated by fragments of what sounded like a 1920s radio program. Music played by orchestras that had been dead for a century, interrupted by weather reports for a town that no longer existed on any map. The GPS on my dashboard began malfunctioning as I drove deeper into the mountains. Instead of showing my position on Interstate 5, it displayed a network of streets labeled with names like Main Street and Church Avenue and Schoolhouse Road. The electronic map showed buildings where there should have been nothing but lake water, a complete town laid out in neat blocks with parks and residential areas in a bustling commercial district. According to the GPS, I was driving through the center of Rockvale, California. I had never heard of Rockvale, but the name filled me with a dread so intense that I had to pull over on the shoulder and catch my breath. My hands were shaking as I reached for my smartphone to search for information about this phantom town. The results I found made my situation infinitely more terrifying than I had imagined. Rockvale had been a thriving community of 3,000 people until 1928, when the state of California decided to build a dam across the Kern River and create Lake Isabella. The entire town was condemned and evacuated, its buildings demolished or simply abandoned to be submerged beneath millions of gallons of mountain runoff. But according to several historical accounts I found online, not everyone had been willing to leave their homes. A group of holdout families had barricaded themselves in the old stone church, refusing to accept government buyouts for their property. They claimed the land had been in their families for generations, that they would rather die than be forced to relocate. When the dam was completed and the valley began to flood, rescue workers found the church doors chained shut from the inside. By the time they broke through, the water was too deep for recovery operations. 47 people had drowned in that church, choosing death over displacement. The dreams intensified as I read the historical accounts. Now I could see the faces more clearly. Men and women and children pressed against the stained glass windows of a church that stood 70 feet beneath the surface of Lake Isabella. They had been trapped underwater for nearly a century, their spirits bound to the place where they had made their final stand against progress and modernity. And now I was carrying their prison with me, 40,000 gallons of their liquid graves sloshing in my trailer as I drove through the California mountains. I tried to continue my delivery route, but the truck began behaving in ways that defied mechanical explanation. My engine would stall without warning whenever I approached towns with populations over 1,000, as if the drowned spirits refused to be transported to areas where they might be forgotten again. My fuel gauge read empty even though I had filled up an hour earlier. The air conditioning blew mist instead of cool air, and the mist smelled of lake water and decomposition. Most disturbing of all, my trailer grew heavier with each mile I traveled. The physics were impossible, but I could feel the added weight pulling at my truck with increasing intensity. My transmission struggled to maintain speed on even gentle grades, and my brakes began overheating from the strain of controlling a load that seemed to be gaining mass from some unknown source. When I stopped to check my logbook, I discovered that my recorded weight had increased by 6,000 pounds since leaving Bakersfield. The water was growing heavier because it was no longer just water. I could see them now even when my eyes were open, translucent figures standing in my trailer and pressing their faces against the interior walls. Men in overalls and women in long dresses, children clutching dolls that had dissolved decades ago. They moved through the liquid medium like it was air, walking on streets that existed only in their memories, living lives that had ended when the waters rose above their windows. They were not trying to hurt me, I realized. They were trying to go home. The 47 souls of Rockvale had been trapped beneath Lake Isabella for 95 years, unable to move on to whatever came after death because their physical remains were still anchored to the bottom of the reservoir. But now, carried in my tanker trailer, they had their first chance in nearly a century to travel beyond the confines of their watery prison. The problem was that they could not agree on where they wanted to go. Some of the spirits wanted me to drive to San Francisco, where relatives might still remember their names and tend their graves. Others insisted I head to Los Angeles, chasing descendants who had scattered to the wind after the flooding. A few demanded that I return to the site where Rockvale had once stood, to dump their essence back into the lake so they could finally rest in familiar territory. Their conflicting desires were tearing my truck apart from the inside. The weight distribution in my trailer shifted constantly as different groups of spirits moved to the front or rear, trying to influence the direction of my travel. My steering wheel jerked left and right without input from me, following the collective will of passengers who had no understanding of highway engineering or traffic laws. I found myself taking exits I had not intended, driving through small towns whose names matched the birthplaces of people who had died before my grandfather was born. In each town, some of the spirits would leave the trailer, finally free to seek whatever resolution they needed. But others would join the water, souls who had been waiting for transportation away from places where they had suffered or died in the decades since Rockvale was flooded. My cargo was becoming a supernatural passenger service, collecting the restless dead from across Central California. The weight continued to increase until my axles were groaning under a load that should have been physically impossible. My truck could barely maintain 30 miles per hour on level ground, and I was forced to take mountain curves at speeds that made other drivers honk their horns in frustration. But I could not drive faster, not with the souls of hundreds of people depending on me to carry them safely to their final destinations. That was when I realized the true horror of my situation. This was not a one-time supernatural encounter that I could survive and put behind me. I had become a permanent part of the network that connected the living world to the realm of the dead. Every load of water I hauled would carry its share of restless spirits, souls who had been trapped in reservoirs and lakes and rivers across the American West. I was no longer just a truck driver, but a ferryman for the deceased, bound to transport the dead until I joined them in whatever liquid grave awaited me. The realization filled me with such despair that I considered driving my rig off a cliff to end the nightmare. But when I approached the guardrail at a scenic overlook, my steering wheel locked in place, controlled by passengers who would not let me destroy their only means of escape from their watery prisons. I was as trapped as they were, bound to serve their needs until my own death freed me to become one of them. Over the following weeks, my routes mysteriously changed to include reservoirs and artificial lakes throughout the western states. Each pickup brought new passengers, souls who had been waiting decades for a chance to travel beyond the boundaries of their liquid confinement. My trailer became a supernatural transit system, carrying the drowned dead to reunions with loved ones or to places where their remains could finally be laid to rest. But the living world began to notice my condition. Other drivers reported seeing figures moving inside my tanker trailer, ghostly faces pressed against the stainless steel walls. Way stations recorded impossible loads that should have collapsed my axles and destroyed my tires. My dispatcher received complaints about deliveries that arrived with water that was ice cold in summer and steaming hot in winter. Liquid that tasted of minerals from lake beds that had been dry for centuries. I tried to quit, but found that I could not walk away from my truck without experiencing symptoms of drowning even on dry land. The spirits had bound me to my vehicle with chains stronger than steel, ensuring that their ferryman would never abandon his post. I was condemned to drive the highways of the American West forever, carrying cargo that grew heavier with each mile as more souls climbed aboard for their final journeys. Last month, I made the mistake of hauling water from Lake Mead, the massive reservoir behind Hoover Dam. The drought has lowered the water level to historic depths, exposing secrets that had been hidden since the 1930s. Bodies are surfacing, victims of violence who were dumped in the lake when Las Vegas was controlled by organized crime. But those are not the only souls stirring in the depths. The water from Lake Mead carried passengers unlike any I had transported before. Not just accidental drowning victims or displaced townspeople, but souls who had chosen violence in life and carried that violence with them into death. They fought each other inside my trailer, creating turbulence that nearly flipped my truck on several occasions. Their anger and malevolence infected the other spirits I was carrying, turning my trailer into a battlefield of the damned. Now I am parked at a rest stop outside of Phoenix, afraid to continue driving but unable to stop. The water in my trailer has turned black with supernatural rage, and I can feel it eating through the metal walls that contain it. When it breaks free, it will flood the Arizona desert with liquid hatred that will corrupt every well and aquifer for hundreds of miles. But I am no longer strong enough to control where my truck goes or what it carries. The spirits have taken over, using my body as a vessel to transport their rage and despair to whatever destinations they choose. I have become a weapon of mass haunting, spreading supernatural contamination across the American landscape. If you see a water hauler driving erratically through your town, with steam rising from its trailer and the smell of lake water following in its wake, do not approach the vehicle. Do not drink from any municipal water system that has received deliveries from trucks like mine. The dead are traveling through our water supplies now, carrying their unfinished business into every home and business that depends on liquid infrastructure. The drought was just the beginning. What comes next will make you wish you had died of thirst instead. Halfway down this road now, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story. Drop a comment and tell us where you're tuned in from. Maybe your own road is hiding something too. Story 5. Night shift collector. The body appeared in my headlights at mile marker 118 on Highway 50, somewhere between Carson City and nowhere at all. One moment the road stretched empty through the Nevada desert. The next, a figure in a hospital gown was standing in my lane, arms outstretched like it was trying to flag me down. I yanked the wheel hard right and felt my trailer jackknife as 18 tons of medical waste tried to follow physics instead of my panic. When I got my rig straightened out and looked back in my mirrors, the road was empty again. Nothing but asphalt and painted lines disappearing into the darkness behind me. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it was connected to what I was hauling in my refrigerated trailer. I had been driving the night shift for Biohazard Transport Solutions for 3 years, collecting medical waste from hospitals and clinics across the Southwest. It was good money and steady work, even if most people found the cargo disturbing. I hauled everything from used bandages to amputated limbs to entire bodies destined for medical schools or research facilities. Death was just business to me, sterile and professional and contained in labeled bags and boxes. But something had changed in the last month. The dead were not staying dead. It started with small things. Sounds coming from my trailer that refrigeration units do not make. Scratching noises like fingernails on metal. Thumping that followed no mechanical rhythm. Temperature alarms going off even though my gauges showed everything running perfectly. I chalked it up to equipment getting old. Maybe some loose cargo shifting around during transport. Then I started seeing them on the road. Always at night, always in remote stretches of highway where there was nowhere for a living person to come from. Figures in hospital gowns or surgical scrubs, standing in the travel lanes or walking along the shoulder with that distinctive shuffle of people who were heavily medicated or very sick. Sometimes they would turn to watch my truck pass, and in those brief moments when my headlights hit their faces, I could see expressions of desperate longing that made my skin crawl. I tried reporting the incidents to the highway patrol, but they found no evidence of pedestrians in areas where I claimed to have seen them. No footprints in the desert sand, no torn fabric on roadside fences, no heat signatures on their thermal cameras. The official conclusion was that I was suffering from fatigue-induced hallucinations, a common problem among long-haul drivers who work the graveyard shift. But I knew the truth was more disturbing than simple exhaustion. The medical waste I transported was not just random biological material. Most of it came from a single source, Mercy General Hospital in Las Vegas, a facility that had been the subject of hushed rumors in the industry for years. Mercy General handled the city's most desperate cases, the patients who arrived at the emergency room with no insurance and no identification. Homeless people and undocumented immigrants and drug addicts whose society had already written off as disposable. According to the shipping manifests, Mercy General generated more medical waste per patient than any other hospital in Nevada. Body parts that should have been cremated were instead being shipped to research facilities that existed only on paper. Organs that could have been donated were instead being sold to pharmaceutical companies for experimental procedures. Even complete bodies were being diverted from their intended destinations, ending up in unmarked graves or simply disappearing from the system entirely. The hospital was harvesting parts from people who had no families to ask questions about what happened to the remains. I realized this 3 weeks ago when I was loading a particularly heavy shipment from Mercy General's morgue. One of the body bags split open as I was moving it onto my lift gate, revealing the face of a man I recognized from previous trips. I had transported him twice before, first as an amputated leg, then as a liver and kidney set. Now here he was again, or what was left of him, being shipped to yet another research facility. They were cutting up the same people multiple times, harvesting every usable piece until nothing remained but empty shells destined for unmarked disposal sites in the desert. That night, driving through the darkness with my macabre cargo, I understood why the dead were appearing on the highways. They were trying to escape the cycle of desecration that had trapped them, seeking some way to break free from the system that treated their remains as nothing more than profitable commodities. But they were bound to the trucks that carried their pieces, forced to follow their own body parts across the Nevada landscape in a grotesque parody of migration. The manifestations grew stronger as I continued making runs for Mercy General. Instead of just seeing figures on the roadside, I began hearing voices coming from my trailer. Whispered pleas for help, demands to know where I was taking them, angry accusations that I was complicit in their suffering. The refrigeration unit could not silence the sound of souls crying out for justice. I tried switching routes, taking loads from other hospitals, but the dead followed me wherever I went. My trailer had become a beacon for restless spirits, attracting every victim of medical exploitation across the Southwest. They sensed that I knew the truth about what was happening to them, and they expected me to do something about it. But what could I do? I was just a truck driver with a high school education and a CDL license. The people responsible for this systematic desecration were doctors and administrators and corporate executives with lawyers and political connections. Even if I tried to expose what I had discovered, who would believe the word of a night shift trucker against the reputation of a major medical institution? The answer came to me during my strangest encounter yet. I was hauling a load of surgical waste from Mercy General to a disposal facility in Utah when my engine died without warning. Not a mechanical failure, but a complete shutdown, as if someone had reached inside and turned off the ignition. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder of Highway 15, surrounded by miles of empty desert under a moonless sky. When I climbed down from my cab to check under the hood, I found my trailer doors standing wide open. The refrigerated compartment was empty, all the carefully labeled bags and boxes gone without explanation. But standing in their place were dozens of translucent figures, the accumulated spirits of everyone whose remains had been processed through the Mercy General body trade. They were not angry anymore. They were organized. The lead figure stepped forward, and I recognized him as the man whose body parts one had transported multiple times. In death, he had somehow regained his wholeness, appearing as he must have looked before illness and poverty and medical exploitation had reduced him to spare parts. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who had moved beyond human concerns into something larger and more terrible. He explained that they had been waiting for someone like me, a witness who could carry their message to the living world. The dead were forming an army, recruiting souls from every corner of the medical waste industry. They had learned to manipulate the vehicles that transported their remains, gaining power over the infrastructure that supported their exploitation. Tonight was the beginning of their revolt against the system that had dehumanized them. My truck started without me turning the key, and I found myself driving not toward my scheduled destination but back toward Las Vegas. The speedometer climbed past 80, past 90, faster than my loaded rig should have been capable of traveling. Other medical waste trucks appeared on the highway around me, all heading in the same direction, all driven by operators whose eyes reflected the pale glow of supernatural possession. We were a convoy of the damned, carrying our cargo of accumulated rage toward the source of our shared horror. Mercy General Hospital rose from the Vegas sprawl like a monument to institutional indifference, its windows blazing with fluorescent light even in the early morning hours. But tonight the building would serve a different purpose, becoming a focal point for supernatural justice that the legal system had been unable to provide. I watched from my cab as dozens of medical waste trucks surrounded the hospital, their refrigerated trailers opening to release the accumulated spirits of thousands of victims. The dead poured out like a tide of translucent humanity, flowing through the hospital, its walls and corridors with the inevitability of water seeking its level. What happened inside the building over the next hour defied rational description. Lights flickered in patterns that spelled out the names of the forgotten dead. Medical equipment activated on its own, performing procedures on empty air as if invisible patients were receiving the care they had been denied in life. The hospital's computer system began displaying the real names and stories of people who had been reduced to anonymous case numbers and shipping manifests. When dawn broke over Las Vegas, Mercy General Hospital had been transformed into a memorial for everyone who had died within its walls. Every surface was covered with names and dates and brief biographies of the victims, written in substances that looked suspiciously like blood but felt cold to the touch. The building's staff was found in various states of psychological breakdown, babbling about voices that demanded accountability for crimes against human dignity. The official investigation concluded that the hospital had suffered a massive computer breach that exposed years of illegal body trafficking operations. Dozens of administrators and doctors were arrested on charges ranging from fraud to desecration of human remains. The facility was shut down permanently, its assets seized to pay compensation to the families of victims. But I knew the real truth about what had happened that night. The dead had taken their revenge, using the medical waste system itself as a weapon against those who had profited from their suffering. They had turned the infrastructure of exploitation into a delivery mechanism for justice, proving that even death could not silence the voices of the truly wronged. Now I drive different routes, hauling legitimate cargo for companies that deal in goods instead of human misery. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the highway stretches empty in all directions, I still see figures standing on the shoulder. Not the angry spirits of the exploited dead, but grateful souls who nod their thanks as I pass, acknowledging the role I played in their final liberation from the cycle of posthumous abuse. The medical waste industry has never been the same since the Mercy General incident. New regulations require full documentation of human remains, with severe penalties for facilities that cannot account for every piece of biological material they generate. The dead are finally being treated with the dignity they deserved in life. Their remains handled according to their wishes rather than the profit margins of corporate medicine. But late at night, when I am driving through remote areas where new medical facilities are being built, I sometimes hear whispers on my CB radio. Voices speaking in languages I do not recognize, sharing information about hospitals and research centers that are trying to restart the old system of exploitation. The dead are still watching, still organizing, still ready to rise again if the living world forgets the lessons learned in Las Vegas. The body trade may be over, but the vigilance of the dead is eternal. Story 6. Dead man. Its last message I heard a dead trucker. S voice on the CB radio giving me the license plate of a truck that had been scrapped 20 years ago. And now I know that some accidents are not accidents at all. My name is Jack Henley, and I have been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years. I thought I had seen every kind of horror the highways could deliver. Multi-car pileups in the fog, brake failures on mountain grades, jackknifed rigs sliding across black ice toward oncoming traffic. But nothing prepared me for what happened on Interstate 80 outside of Laramie, Wyoming, on a cold October morning when I became the first witness to an impossible message from beyond the grave. The accident scene was still smoking when I crested the hill at mile marker 215. A single truck had gone off the road, crashed through the guardrail, and rolled down a steep embankment before slamming into a stand of pine trees. The trailer had separated from the cab and was lying on its side about 50 yards away, spilling lumber across the rocky slope like giant matchsticks. I pulled over immediately and called 911 on my cell phone. No signal. The mountains around Laramie create dead zones where cellular towers cannot reach, leaving drivers dependent on CB radio for emergency communication. I grabbed my radio handset and started broadcasting a Mayday call on Channel 19, hoping other truckers in the area would relay the message to authorities. While I waited for emergency responders, I climbed down the embankment to check on the driver. The cab was crushed against a massive pine tree, accordion folded from the impact. Steam rose from the radiator, and I could smell antifreeze mixed with diesel fuel and something else. Something organic and terrible that I recognized from other accident scenes. The driver was dead, no question about it. The steering column had been driven back through the seat, and the entire front end of the cab had collapsed into the driver compartment. But I could see enough to know this had been a fellow professional, wearing a company uniform and the kind of work boots that marked him as a long-haul driver. I was walking back toward my truck to get flares and reflective triangles when I heard the CB radio crackle to life. Not my radio, but the one in the wrecked cab. Impossible, given the extent of the damage. But I could hear static and then something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A voice, weak and fading, like someone speaking through water or from a great distance. But unmistakably human, and unmistakably desperate. The voice was giving a license plate number. 4 letters and 2 numbers that I scrambled to write down on the back of a fuel receipt. Then came the words that still wake me up at night, 20 years after I heard them spoken by a man whose body was already cooling in the wreckage below. They ran me off the road. The transmission ended with a burst of static, and the radio went silent. I stood on the shoulder of Interstate 80, staring at the piece of paper in my hands, trying to process what I had just experienced. The dead driver had somehow used his CB radio to send a final message, identifying the vehicle that had caused his fatal accident. Emergency responders arrived 30 minutes later. Highway patrol, paramedics, fire department, and a wrecker crew to extract the cab from the trees. I gave my statement to the investigating trooper, describing what I had seen and heard. But I did not mention the voice on the CB radio. How do you explain to a law enforcement officer that you received a message from a dead man? The trooper confirmed what I already knew. The driver was deceased, probably killed instantly when the cab struck the trees. His name was Robert Martinez, 47 years old, from Tucson, Arizona. He had been hauling lumber from Oregon to a construction site in Colorado, a routine run on a route he had driven dozens of times. The initial investigation suggested driver fatigue or mechanical failure. Martinez had been driving for 11 hours, approaching his legal limit for continuous operation. The road was dry and visibility was good, but the mountain curves could be tricky for drivers who were not familiar with the terrain. but I had the license plate number that Martinez had somehow transmitted after his death. I waited until the scene was cleared and the official investigation was complete. Then I started making phone calls. The plate number led to a truck that had been registered in Wyoming from 1998 to 2003. A Peterbilt 379 with a sleeper cab, owned by a driver named Carl Voss. But according to Department of Motor Vehicles records, that truck had been totaled in a fatal accident in 2003 and sold for scrap metal. It had not been on the road for 20 years. I dug deeper into the records of Carl Voss and his destroyed truck. The accident had happened on the same stretch of Interstate 80 where Robert Martinez had died, almost to the mile. Voss had been hauling steel pipe from Utah to Nebraska when his truck crossed the center line and collided head-on with a minivan carrying a family of 4. All 5 people died in the crash. The investigation had concluded that Voss fell asleep at the wheel, causing the collision that killed him and 4 innocent people. His truck was so badly damaged that it was sold to a scrapyard immediately after the wreckage was cleared. The insurance company had paid out nearly $2 million in claims, and the case was closed. But something about the official story bothered me. I had been driving trucks for 23 years, and I knew the difference between a driver who fell asleep and one who had been forced off the road. The skid marks, the impact angles, the final positions of the vehicles all told a story that did not match the conclusion in the police report. I started reaching out to other drivers who had worked the Interstate 80 corridor in 2003, looking for anyone who remembered Carl Voss or the accident that killed him and the family in the minivan. Most guys had moved on to other routes or retired, but I found 3 drivers who remembered the incident clearly. All of them said the same thing. Carl Voss was one of the safest drivers on the road, a professional with over 1 million miles without an accident. He did not drink, did not use drugs, and was obsessive about following hours of service regulations. The idea that he fell asleep at the wheel did not match what anyone knew about his driving habits. More importantly, 2 of the drivers remembered seeing Voss at a truck stop in Rawlins, Wyoming, about an hour before the accident. He had been talking on his CB radio, describing another truck that had been following him too closely and making aggressive lane changes. Voss was concerned about the behavior and had asked other drivers to watch for the vehicle if they saw it on the road. I found the CB radio logs from that night, archived by a volunteer group that monitored emergency channels in the Laramie area. Sure enough, there was a transmission from Carl Voss at 10:47 p.m., reporting a truck that was tailgating and trying to force him off the road. He gave a partial license plate number and described the other vehicle as a dark-colored Kenworth with an unmarked trailer. The last transmission from Voss came at 11:15 p.m. He said the other truck had pulled alongside him and was trying to force him into oncoming traffic. He was requesting immediate assistance from any law enforcement officers monitoring the channel. The fatal collision happened at 11:22 p.m. I realized that Carl Voss had not fallen asleep at the wheel. He had been murdered, forced off the road by another truck driver in what looked like an accident but was actually vehicular homicide. The official investigation had missed or ignored evidence that pointed to foul play, closing the case as driver fatigue to avoid the complications of a multiple homicide investigation. But if Carl Voss had been murdered in 2003, why was Robert Martinez receiving messages from his ghost 20 years later? What connected 2 truckers who had died decades apart on the same stretch of highway? I started researching other accidents on Interstate 80 between Laramie and Rawlins, focusing on single-vehicle crashes involving commercial trucks. What I found was a pattern that had been hidden by the vast distances and jurisdictional boundaries of interstate commerce. Over the past 30 years, 17 truck drivers had died in solo accidents on that specific stretch of highway. All of them had been experienced professionals with clean driving records. All of them had been hauling valuable cargo. And all of them had died in circumstances that could be explained as driver error but might also indicate foul play. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for. The accidents happened at irregular intervals, sometimes years apart, but always on the same remote section of highway where cellular coverage was limited and response times were long. The drivers were always alone, always hauling loads worth stealing, and always found dead in their cabs with injuries consistent with high-speed impacts. I realized I was looking at the work of a highway predator, someone who had been murdering truck drivers for 3 decades and disguising the crimes as accidents. The killer was probably another trucker, someone who knew the routes and schedules and could identify profitable targets, someone who used a vehicle that blended in with legitimate commercial traffic. But the license plate number that Robert Martinez had transmitted from beyond the grave belonged to a truck that had been scrapped in 2003. How could a destroyed vehicle be involved in a murder that happened 20 years later? The answer came from an unexpected source. I was researching salvage yards and scrap dealers who might have processed Carl Voss' destroyed truck when I found a forum post from a parts dealer in Nebraska. He was looking for information about a Peterbilt 379 that he had purchased from a Wyoming scrapyard in 2003. According to the dealer, the truck had been so badly damaged that most of it was worthless for parts. But the engine block, transmission, and some other components had been salvageable. He had sold these parts to various buyers over the years, including the engine and transmission to a shop in Colorado that specialized in rebuilding wrecked trucks. I contacted the Colorado shop and learned that they had used Carl Voss' engine and transmission to rebuild a different truck, a Kenworth that had been damaged in a minor accident. The rebuilt truck had been sold to a driver who worked the western states, hauling loads between California and the mountain states. The rebuilt truck was still on the road, driven by a man named Dale Kruger who had been working Interstate 80 for over 20 years. His route took him through the exact area where Robert Martinez had died, and where Carl Voss had been murdered in 2003. I started tracking Kruger's movements through shipping manifests and inspection records. He was a legitimate driver with proper licenses and insurance, but his route patterns were suspicious. He seemed to be in the right place at the right time for many of the solo truck accidents I had researched. More disturbing was the discovery that Kruger's current truck was registered with the same license plate number that had been used on Carl Voss' destroyed vehicle. Through some paperwork error or deliberate manipulation, the state of Wyoming had reissued the same plate to the rebuilt truck that contained Voss' original engine and transmission. In essence, part of Carl Voss' murdered truck was still traveling the highways, carrying the license plate of the vehicle that had been destroyed after his death. And that same truck was being used to commit new murders, continuing a pattern of highway killings that had started decades earlier. I realized that Robert Martinez had somehow received a psychic impression from the rebuilt truck, its components, the engine and transmission that had belonged to Carl Voss, this murdered vehicle. The mechanical parts retained some kind of spiritual connection to their original owner, allowing Voss' ghost to communicate through the CB radio of his killer's next victim. It was crazy, but it was the only explanation that fit the facts. Carl Voss had been trying to warn other drivers about his murderer for 20 years, but no one had been listening. Robert Martinez had been his first successful contact, transmitting the license plate number that connected all the deaths on Interstate 80. I had enough information to contact the FBI with a theory about serial highway murders, but I needed proof that would convince federal investigators to take the case seriously. I decided to set myself up as bait, hauling valuable cargo on the route where Kruger operated, hoping to draw him into making another attempt. I loaded my trailer with computer equipment bound for Denver, advertising the shipment on load boards that Kruger might monitor for potential targets. Then I started driving the Interstate 80 corridor, broadcasting my position and cargo details on CB channels where the killer might be listening. It took 3 trips before I got his attention. I was eastbound through the mountains between Laramie and Rawlins when I noticed a dark Kenworth following me at a consistent distance. The truck stayed back far enough to avoid identification but close enough to monitor my movements. I started broadcasting warnings on the CB radio, describing the truck that was following me and asking other drivers to report its position to authorities. But the response I got was not from living truckers. It was from Carl Voss himself, speaking through my radio with the same fading voice that Robert Martinez had used weeks earlier. The ghost of the murdered driver was warning me about the specific tactics his killer would use. Kruger would wait until we reached the most remote section of highway, then pull alongside and try to force me off the road. If that failed, he would use the pit maneuver, striking my trailer at an angle that would send my truck into an uncontrollable spin. Armed with this supernatural intelligence, I was able to anticipate Kruger's attack and counter his moves. When he pulled alongside to force me toward the guardrail, I accelerated and pulled ahead. When he tried to strike my trailer, I hit my brakes and let him overshoot the target. The battle continued for 20 miles of mountain highway, 2 18-wheelers playing a deadly game of cat and mouse while the ghost of Carl Voss provided tactical advice through my CB radio. Finally, I was able to maneuver Kruger into a position where he lost control on a curve and crashed into the same stand of trees where Robert Martinez had died. I called the authorities and waited for investigators to arrive at the scene. Kruger was critically injured but alive, trapped in the cab of the truck that contained the engine and transmission from Carl Voss' murdered vehicle. When paramedics extracted him from the wreckage, he immediately started confessing to decades of highway murders. The FBI investigation that followed confirmed my theory about the serial killer who had been disguising murders as accidents for 30 years. Kruger had been targeting truck drivers with valuable cargo, forcing them off the road and stealing their loads. He had killed 19 drivers in 7 states, accumulating millions of dollars in stolen merchandise while authorities attributed the deaths to driver fatigue and mechanical failure. But the most disturbing discovery came when investigators examined Kruger's truck. The engine block still bore traces of blood from Carl Voss's original accident, and the transmission case had scratches that matched the impact patterns from the 2003 collision. The mechanical components had somehow retained physical evidence of the first murder, preserving it for 20 years until justice could finally be served. Carl Voss had been trying to communicate his killer's identity through the CB radio system for 2 decades, using the electromagnetic properties of his own engine and transmission to generate the voices that Robert Martinez and I had heard. The ghost in the machine was literally true, a murdered driver whose spirit was bound to the mechanical parts of his destroyed truck. The case made national headlines as an example of how serial killers could operate undetected in the anonymous world of interstate commerce. But the supernatural elements of the investigation were kept classified, too strange and unbelievable for public consumption. I received commendations from the FBI and several trucking organizations for helping to solve the highway murders. But the real heroes were Carl Voss and Robert Martinez, 2 dead drivers who had reached across the boundary between life and death to identify their killer and prevent future murders. I still drive the interstate highways, but I pay more attention to my CB radio now. Sometimes, late at night on lonely stretches of road, I hear voices that might be more than just other drivers talking about weather and traffic conditions. I hear warnings about dangerous vehicles, descriptions of suspicious behavior, and license plate numbers that belong to trucks that should not exist. The highway system is haunted by the spirits of drivers who died violently, their voices preserved in the radio waves that connect all of us who make our living on America's roads. They are still out there, still trying to help their fellow drivers avoid the dangers that took their own lives. Listen to your CB radio. Pay attention to the voices in the static. Sometimes the dead have important messages for the living, and sometimes those messages are the only thing standing between you and a killer who uses the highways as his hunting ground. Carl Voss got his justice after 20 years of trying to communicate with the living. But there are other ghosts out there, other victims of highway predators who are still trying to warn us about the dangers that lurk in the spaces between cities. The road is never as empty as it seems. And sometimes, the most important passenger in your truck is the voice on the radio that no one else can hear. Story 7. Glitch in the weigh station scale. The digital scale at the Wyoming weigh station showed my truck weighing 94,000 pounds, which was impossible since my loaded weight should have been exactly 80,000 pounds. The attendant stared at his computer screen, scratching his head with the confusion of a man who had been working scales for 20 years and had never seen anything like it. He asked me to pull forward and try again, his voice carrying the tired frustration of someone dealing with malfunctioning equipment at 3 in the morning. But when I drove back onto the scale for the second weigh, the display showed my correct weight of exactly 80,000 pounds. Then the screen flickered, the numbers disappeared, and a single word appeared in bold letters that made my blood run cold. Run. My name is Jake Patterson, and I have been hauling freight across this country for 14 years. I thought the weigh stations were just another bureaucratic headache, places where debt officials checked your logbooks and made sure you were not overloaded. I never imagined one of them would save my life by warning me about something that should not have existed. The weigh station sat on Interstate 80 near Laramie, one of those modern facilities with digital scales and automated systems that could process dozens of trucks per hour. I was eastbound with a load of construction equipment from Portland to Denver, running ahead of schedule for once in my career. The facility looked normal enough as I pulled in. Bright LED lighting, clean concrete, signs directing commercial vehicles to the proper lanes. But something felt wrong from the moment I drove through the entrance. The air seemed thicker somehow, charged with an electrical tension that made the hair on my arms stand up. There were no other trucks in line, which was unusual for this time of night on this particular stretch of highway. Interstate 80 through Wyoming was one of the busiest freight corridors in the country. There should have been a steady stream of commercial traffic, especially during peak driving hours when most long-haul drivers were trying to make up time. The attendant waved me onto the scale with the bored efficiency of someone who had performed the same motions thousands of times. Middle-aged guy with a dot uniform and the pale complexion of someone who worked night shifts. Nothing unusual about him except for the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he was expecting something to emerge from the darkness beyond the facility lights. I positioned my truck on the scale and waited for the weight reading. The digital display cycled through its normal startup sequence, then showed numbers that made no sense at all. According to the scale, my truck and trailer weighed 94,000 pounds. But my loaded weight, verified at the shipper in Portland, was exactly 80,000 pounds. The extra 14,000 pounds was impossible. I had not picked up any additional cargo, had not stopped anywhere that could have added weight to my load. The only explanation was a malfunctioning scale, which happened more often than officials like to admit. The attendant walked out to check the reading, his flashlight beam dancing across the numbers on his handheld device. He shook his head and muttered something about computer glitches, then directed me to pull forward and try again. As I drove off the scale and repositioned my truck, I noticed something that had not been there before. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt beside the scale platform, as if another vehicle had been parked there recently. But the tracks were wrong. They were too deep, too wide, like they had been made by something much heavier than any normal truck. The second weigh showed my correct weight, but then came the message that changed everything. Run, in block letters across the digital display, flashing 3 times before disappearing completely. The attendant saw it too. I watched his face go pale in the LED lighting, watched him take an involuntary step backward from his computer terminal. He had seen this before. Whatever was happening at this weigh station, it was not the first time. I climbed out of my cab and walked over to the scale house, planning to ask what was going on. But the attendant was already packing up his equipment with the desperate efficiency of someone who knew exactly what that message meant. He told me to get out of there immediately. Do not stop for fuel. Do not use the rest facilities. Do not even slow down until I was at least 50 miles away from this location. His hands were shaking as he handed me my weight certificate, and I could see sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. I asked him what was wrong, what that message meant, why he was so terrified. But he just shook his head and repeated his warning. Get out, now, before it comes back. I was about to press him for more information when the lights went out. Not just the scale house lights, but everything. The LED floods that illuminated the entire facility, the computer displays, the exit signs, even the navigation lights on the nearby radio tower. The weigh station was suddenly plunged into absolute darkness, as if someone had thrown a master switch and cut all power to the area. But that was not the strangest part. The strangest part was the sound that came with the darkness, a low rumbling that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. Like the growl of some massive engine, but deeper, more primal. The sound of something that was not quite mechanical and not quite alive. I ran for my truck, guided only by muscle memory and the faint glow of my dashboard lights. The attendant was right behind me, his breathing harsh and panicked. As I climbed into my cab, I could see him sprinting toward a small building at the edge of the facility, probably his office or a bunker where he could hide until whatever was happening passed. I fired up my engine and put the truck in gear, but before I could pull away, the power came back on. The facility lights blazed to life, revealing something that should not have been there. Another truck was parked on the scale. A massive semi that dwarfed my own rig, black as midnight and covered in what looked like rust stains or dried blood. It had no visible company markings, no license plates, no dot numbers. Just smooth black metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The scale was showing its weight, and the numbers made my brain hurt to look at. Not 94,000 pounds like my truck had registered, but something impossible. The digital display was cycling through readings that climbed higher and higher, as if the truck was getting heavier while I watched. 100,000 pounds, 150,000, 200,000, numbers that no truck could possibly weigh, numbers that should have collapsed the scale platform under their impossible mass. But the concrete held, and the black truck sat there like a monument to something that existed outside the normal laws of physics. I could see movement in the cab, a shadow that might have been a driver, but the windows were too dark to make out any details. That was when I noticed the smell. Even with my windows rolled up and my air conditioning running, I could smell it. The stench of decay, of things that had been dead for a long time. It was coming from the black truck, seeping through the metal and glass like a fog of corruption. The scale display hit 500,000 pounds and kept climbing. The concrete beneath the truck began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading outward from the massive weight pressing down on it. But instead of collapsing, the cracks seemed to be absorbing something from the truck above. dark liquid that flowed into the concrete like oil soaking into sand. I realized what I was looking at. The black truck was not just impossibly heavy. It was leaking the weight of something else. Something that had been collected from other places, other way stations, other drivers who had not received the warning to run. The digital display on my own scale flickered back to life, showing a new message that confirmed my worst fears. The word run was replaced by something else. Something that told me exactly what I was dealing with. Collector. This truck was not just heavy because of some supernatural cargo. It was heavy because it carried the weight of every driver it had claimed, every soul it had absorbed from trucks that had stopped at the wrong way station at the wrong time. And now it was here, adding to its collection. I floored the accelerator and tore out of that way station like the devil himself was chasing me. In my mirrors, I watched the black truck begin to move, pulling off the scale with the ponderous motion of something that carried far more than just physical weight. The facility lights went out again as I reached the highway, but this time they did not come back on. The way station disappeared into darkness behind me, and with it went any evidence that what I had seen was real. I drove for 3 hours straight before I felt safe enough to stop for fuel. When I finally pulled into a truck stop in Nebraska, I tried to research what I had experienced. The internet showed nothing unusual about the Wyoming way station. No reports of equipment malfunctions. No stories about mysterious trucks. No warnings about avoiding the facility during night hours. But when I checked trucking forums and driver message boards, I found scattered references to similar incidents. Drivers who had encountered impossible weight readings at various scales across the country. Trucks that appeared and disappeared without explanation. Equipment that displayed warnings to run before cutting to darkness. The pattern was always the same. A driver would pull into a way station during off-peak hours and encounter a scale malfunction that showed impossibly high weights. If they were lucky, the equipment would warn them to leave. If they were not lucky, they would encounter the collector. No one knew what the collector was or where it came from. Some theories suggested it was the spirit of a driver who had died in a way station accident, now condemned to roam the highways collecting others to share his fate. Other stories claimed it was something older, something that had been using the road system to hunt long before trucks existed. But all the accounts agreed on one thing. The collector was drawn to way stations because they were places where trucks were forced to stop, where drivers were vulnerable and isolated. And it used the scales themselves as some kind of supernatural detection system, measuring not just the weight of trucks but the weight of souls. The extra 14,000 pounds my truck had registered was not an equipment malfunction. It was the collector taking my measure, determining whether I was worth adding to its collection. The fact that the scale had shown my correct weight on the second attempt meant I had passed some kind of test. That something about me was not suitable for whatever purpose the collector served. But the warning to run suggested that passing the test was not enough. The collector would return, would keep trying until it found a way to claim me. I was marked now, identified as a potential target for something that existed to harvest drivers from the highways they traveled. Over the next few months, I encountered evidence of the collector's presence at way stations across the country. Scales that showed impossible readings, equipment that flickered with warnings, attendants who worked with the nervous energy of people who knew they were stationed at the edge of something dark and dangerous. I learned to recognize the signs. Way stations that were unusually empty during peak hours. Facilities where the lighting seemed dimmer, the shadows deeper. Scales that took too long to display readings, as if they were measuring something more complex than simple weight. And I learned to avoid those places. When my route took me through areas where the collector was active, I would find alternate paths. Sometimes this meant driving hundreds of miles out of my way, burning extra fuel and losing money on tight delivery schedules. But it was better than becoming another soul added to that impossible weight. The trucking industry has informal networks for sharing information about road conditions, law enforcement activity, and hazardous locations. But there is also a darker network, drivers who pass warnings about supernatural dangers that official channels would never acknowledge. I became part of that network. I shared information about way stations to avoid, times when the collector was most active, routes that offered safer alternatives for drivers who knew what to look for. Because the collector was not just haunting one location in Wyoming. It was mobile, traveling the highway system like any other truck. But instead of carrying freight, it was carrying the accumulated weight of every driver it had claimed over the decades. The reports I gathered suggested it had been active since at least the 1950s, when the interstate highway system was first being developed. Always appearing at way stations, always using the scales to measure potential victims, always collecting those who failed whatever test it applied. Some drivers theorized that the collector was drawn to those who carried guilt, regret, or some other emotional weight that it could sense through the supernatural properties of the scales. Others believed it was random, that anyone could become a target if they encountered it at the wrong time. But I had a different theory. I thought the collector was maintaining some kind of balance, taking drivers who had somehow cheated death or avoided accidents that should have claimed them. The extra weight it carried was not just souls, but the accumulated debt of lives that had been extended beyond their natural end. The warning system built into the way stations was not trying to save drivers from the collector. It was trying to save the collector from claiming the wrong targets, people whose time had not yet come. That would explain why I had been warned to run instead of simply being taken. I had not yet accumulated enough karmic debt to be worth collecting. But that could change. Every mile I drove, every risk I took, every close call I survived was adding weight to some cosmic scale that the collector could read through the digital displays at way stations. 6 months after my first encounter, I received a call from my dispatcher about a rush delivery. Electronics from Los Angeles to New York, premium freight that would pay well if I could make the aggressive timeline. The route would take me through multiple states, including a mandatory way station check in Colorado. I almost turned down the load. The way station in Colorado was one of the locations where other drivers had reported collector activity. But the money was too good to pass up, and I convinced myself that I could handle whatever I might encounter. The Colorado way station looked normal during the day, but I was not scheduled to reach it until well after midnight. By the time I arrived, the facility would be operating with minimal staff, the kind of isolated conditions where the collector was most likely to appear. I pulled in at 2:17 a.m., exactly as my logbook had predicted. The attendant was different from the one in Wyoming, younger and more nervous. But he had the same look of someone who had seen things that were not supposed to exist. The scale reading came back normal this time. Exactly 80,000 pounds, no mysterious extra weight, no system malfunctions. I was beginning to think I had worried about nothing when the display flickered and showed a new message. Not run this time, but something that made my heart stop. Collected. The attendant was backing away from his terminal, his face pale with terror. In the distance, I could hear the sound of a massive engine approaching the way station. The same deep rumble I had heard in Wyoming, the sound of something that carried impossible weight. The collector had found me. I tried to start my truck, but the engine would not turn over. The electrical systems were failing one by one, as if something was draining the power from my vehicle. My CB radio crackled with static, and through the interference I could hear voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in a chorus of despair. They were the drivers the collector had claimed over the decades, their voices trapped in that black truck, their souls part of the impossible weight it carried across the highways of America. And now they were welcoming me to join them. The black truck pulled into the way station with the slow inevitability of a funeral procession. Up close, I could see that the rust stains on its surface were not rust at all, but something organic. Something that had once been human. The scale beneath it registered weights that climbed beyond any rational number. 1 million pounds, 10 million, numbers that should have cracked the earth itself. But the concrete held, reinforced by whatever supernatural force allowed the collector to exist. I climbed out of my dead truck and walked toward the black semi, no longer trying to escape. The test was over, and I had failed. Whatever weight the collector had been measuring, I had finally accumulated enough to be worth collecting. The cab door opened as I approached, revealing not a driver but a void. An absence of light and matter that pulled at me with gravitational force. I could hear the voices of the collected drivers calling from within that darkness, promising that the weight I carried would finally be lifted once I joined them. I stepped toward the void, ready to accept whatever fate awaited me in that impossible truck. But something stopped me. A hand on my shoulder, pulling me back from the edge of oblivion. The attendant had not fled like I expected. He was standing behind me, his flashlight cutting through the darkness around the collector's truck. And in that beam of light, I could see something that changed everything. The black truck was not solid. It was translucent, like a reflection on dark water. The voices of the collected drivers were not coming from inside the cab, but from the scale itself. From the concrete platform that had been absorbing the weight of souls for decades. The collector was not a truck at all. It was the way station itself. The scales, the concrete, the digital systems that measured not just physical weight but the spiritual burden carried by every driver who passed through. And the attendant was not just an employee. He was the guardian of this place, the one person who understood what it really was and how to keep it contained. He explained it to me as the false truck faded away like morning mist. The way stations were built on sites where the highway system intersected with something older, something that predated roads and trucks in the modern world. Places where the boundary between life and death was thin enough for certain kinds of entities to cross over. The collector was one of those entities, something that fed on guilt and regret and the weight of poor choices. It used the infrastructure of the way stations to identify potential victims, drivers who carried enough spiritual burden to be worth consuming. But the system was also designed to protect those who were not ready to be collected. The warnings, the equipment malfunctions, even the terrifying visions were all part of a defense mechanism built into the scales themselves. The attendants at these stations were not just DOT employees. They were guardians, people who understood the true nature of what they were protecting. They kept the collector contained, prevented it from roaming freely across the highway system, ensured that it only claimed those who had truly earned their fate. I had passed the test after all. The weight I carried was not enough to warrant collection, and the warning systems had been trying to save me from something I was not meant to experience. But the encounter had changed me. I could no longer drive past way stations without remembering what I had learned about the hidden infrastructure of America, its highways. The system that was designed not just to enforce regulations and collect taxes, but to maintain the balance between the living and the dead. I still haul freight across this country, still pass through way stations on a regular basis. But now I understand what those scales are really measuring. And I try to keep my spiritual weight as light as possible, because I know there are places on the highway system where that weight can drag you down into darkness. If you are a driver, if you haul freight across the empty highways of America, pay attention to the readings at way stations. If your truck shows impossible weight, if the digital display flickers with warnings, if attendants look at you with the eyes of people who have seen too much, listen to what they are trying to tell you. The scales are measuring more than just the weight of your cargo. They are measuring the weight of your soul. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the facility lights, the collector is still waiting to claim those who tip the balance too far toward the heavy side of that cosmic scale. Story 8. Stowaway who never was. I helped a desperate man escape from a compartment that had been welded shut for 15 years. And the next morning, he never existed. My name is Miguel Santos, and I have been running freight across the Mexican border for 12 years. I know every checkpoint, every inspection routine, every trick the smugglers use to hide their cargo. But 3 weeks ago, somewhere between Laredo and San Antonio, I discovered that some mysteries run deeper than human trafficking or drug running. Some mysteries reach across time itself. It started with a routine crossing at the Laredo port of entry. I was hauling machine parts from Monterrey to a factory in Dallas, legitimate cargo with proper documentation. The border agents were thorough but professional, using mirrors and dogs to inspect my 40-foot trailer. They found nothing suspicious because there was nothing to find, just steel components wrapped in plastic and foam, headed north to keep American factories running. The inspection took 2 hours. Standard procedure. I waited in the cab while agents crawled under my trailer, checking every weld, every joint, every place where contraband might be hidden. They tapped the walls with hammers, listening for hollow sounds that might indicate false compartments. They ran drug-sniffing dogs along the entire length of the rig. Everything came back clean. I crossed into Texas around 4 in the afternoon and drove north on Interstate 35. The sun was setting behind me, painting the sky blood orange above endless scrubland. I had driven this route hundreds of times, but something felt different that evening. The trailer seemed heavier, more sluggish on the hills. My fuel consumption was higher than normal. Small changes that could mean mechanical problems or uneven cargo distribution. I pulled into a truck stop outside San Antonio around midnight to check my load and get some sleep. The parking area was nearly empty, just a few other rigs scattered under sodium lights that turned everything the color of old brass. I did my usual walk-around inspection, checking tires and lights and cargo straps. That is when I heard the scratching. It was coming from underneath the trailer, near the rear axle. A rhythmic scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across metal. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled under to investigate. The noise stopped as soon as I got close, but I could see fresh scratches in the paint around one of the support beams. I was examining the marks when I heard a voice, muffled, desperate, speaking Spanish with a thick accent I recognized from the mountains of Chihuahua. He was calling for help, begging someone to let him out. The voice was coming from inside the trailer wall itself. I crawled deeper under the rig, following the sound. There, hidden behind a maze of brake lines and electrical cables, I found something that should not have existed. A rectangular panel in the trailer floor, about 3 feet by 2 feet, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. The edges were sealed with what looked like industrial adhesive, but I could see scratches around the perimeter where someone had tried to claw their way out. The voice was stronger now, more urgent. A young man, maybe 20 years old, pleading in Spanish and broken English. He said his name was Carlos. He said he had been trapped for days without food or water. He said the smugglers had sealed him in and forgotten about him after the border crossing went wrong. I ran back to my cab and grabbed a crowbar from my toolkit. The adhesive was old and brittle, cracking away in chunks when I pried at the edges. But underneath the sealant was something else. Spot welds. Professional metal work that looked like it had been done in a factory. This was not a smuggling compartment. This was part of the trailer, its original design. It took me 20 minutes to break through the welds and pry open the panel. The smell that hit me was indescribable. Human waste, fierce sweat, and something else. Something sweet and rotten that made my stomach turn. I shined my flashlight into the opening and saw him. Carlos was maybe 19 years old, thin and desperate, with hollow cheeks and eyes that reflected my light like an animal. He was wearing clothes that looked like they had been expensive once. Designer jeans and a polo shirt that were now filthy and torn. His hands were bloody from scratching at the walls of his prison. He scrambled out of the compartment like a man escaping from a grave. His Spanish was rapid and panicked, but I caught enough to understand his story. He had paid smugglers in Nuevo Laredo to get him across the border. They had hidden him in what they claimed was a secret compartment, promising to release him once they reached Houston. But something had gone wrong. The crossing had been delayed, and the smugglers had vanished, leaving him trapped. I helped him to his feet and offered him water from my emergency supplies. He drank like he had not seen liquid in weeks, gulping down entire bottles while I tried to process what had happened. How had border agents missed a hidden compartment with a living person inside? How had I not noticed the extra weight during my pre-trip inspection? Carlos was in bad shape but not dying, dehydrated and weak, but not at the edge of death you would expect from someone trapped without supplies for days. I gave him food from my cab and let him clean up in the truck stop bathroom. While he was washing, I examined the compartment more carefully. The space was maybe 4 feet long and 2 feet wide, barely large enough for a person to lie down. The walls were lined with some kind of sound-deadening material that explained why I had not heard him during the border inspection. But the construction was wrong. The welds were too old, too professional. This looked like military work, not something cobbled together by smugglers. I found scratches in the metal that went deeper than Carlos could have made in a few days. Some of the marks looked ancient, worn smooth by years of exposure. And there were stains on the floor that had soaked too deeply into the metal to be recent. Dark brown stains that looked like dried blood. When Carlos came back from the bathroom, I asked him about the compartment. He said the smugglers had told him it was a new design, completely invisible to border technology. They had guaranteed safe passage for $2,000, payment on delivery. But he had been sealed inside for what felt like weeks, not days. I asked him about the date. When had he crossed the border? When had the smugglers abandoned him? His answer made my blood run cold. Carlos said he had been sealed in the compartment on March 15, 2008. 15 years ago. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. Carlos looked 19 years old. His clothes were modern but not current, like fashion from the late 2000s. His cell phone was an old flip model that had not been manufactured in over a decade. And he spoke about recent events like they were happening now, but his references were all 15 years out of date. I pulled out my phone and showed him the date. September 2023. He stared at the screen like it was written in a foreign language. According to him, it was still 2008. George Bush was president. The economy was collapsing. He had been trying to cross the border to find work in the construction boom that had ended before I started driving trucks. The impossible truth was staring me in the face, but my mind refused to accept it. Carlos was not a recent stowaway. He was a ghost from 15 years ago, somehow preserved in a compartment that had been sealed since the border crossing went wrong in 2008. I helped him into my cab and drove toward the nearest immigration office. Carlos was grateful but confused about why everything looked different. The trucks were newer, the roads had been repaved, the billboards advertised products he had never heard of. He kept asking about friends and family members, phone numbers that had been disconnected years ago. As we drove through the night, I noticed something else. Carlos was not aging. His injuries were not healing, but they were not getting worse either. The cuts on his hands stayed exactly the same depth and color. His dehydration seemed frozen at a specific level. Even his clothes remained precisely as dirty as they had been when I found him. We reached the immigration office in San Antonio at dawn. I parked in the visitor lot and helped Carlos out of the cab. He was nervous about dealing with authorities, but I convinced him that 15 years had passed and the statute of limitations had probably run out on whatever border violation had trapped him. The immigration officer who interviewed us was professional but skeptical. She listened to our story with the patience of someone who had heard every possible excuse and variation. When I described finding Carlos in the hidden compartment, she asked to see my trailer registration and inspection records. That is when the story fell apart completely. According to the official documentation, my trailer had been manufactured in 2019. It had never been modified or altered. There were no hidden compartments in the design specifications. The serial numbers matched a completely standard freight hauler with no special features. The officer ran Carlos through the system using every piece of information he could provide. Name, date of birth, fingerprints, everything. No records existed. No Carlos Mendez from Chihuahua had ever been arrested, processed, or reported missing at the border. No smuggling operation matching his description had been broken up in 2008. No missing person reports matched his details. According to every database the government maintained, Carlos had never existed. I insisted on showing them the compartment. We walked out to my trailer in the parking lot, and I crawled underneath to find the panel I had pried open the night before. But there was nothing there. No scratches in the paint. No signs of welding or modification. Just solid metal floor, exactly like the manufacturer's specifications indicated. I ran my hands over the area where the compartment had been. Smooth steel, no seams, no joints, no indication that anything had ever been hidden there. The officer watched me search with the expression of someone dealing with a driver who had been on the road too long. But Carlos was standing right there beside us, flesh and blood, as real as anything I had ever touched. I asked the officer to interview him again, to run more comprehensive searches. She agreed, but when we turned around, Carlos was gone. He had vanished as completely as the compartment that had held him. No footprints in the dusty parking lot. No sign that he had ever been there at all. The immigration officer looked at me with concern and suggested I see a doctor about possible hallucinations brought on by fatigue. I drove back to the truck stop where I had found Carlos, hoping to find some trace of evidence. The water bottles I had given him were gone. The food wrappers had disappeared. Even the scratches I had seen on the trailer floor were nowhere to be found. It was as if the entire encounter had been erased from reality. But I knew what I had experienced. I had felt Carlos grip my hand when I helped him out of the compartment. I had smelled his fear and desperation. I had heard his voice, seen his tears, shared my food with a human being who needed help. I started researching missing persons cases from 2008, focusing on the Laredo border area. I found dozens of reports about young men who had disappeared while trying to cross into the United States. The smuggling trade was brutal and unforgiving, leaving families with no answers and authorities with no leads. One name caught my attention. Carlos Mendez, age 19, from a small town outside Chihuahua. Reported missing by his family in March 2008 after he left to meet smugglers in Nuevo Laredo. The description matched perfectly. Height, weight, distinctive scar on his left hand from a childhood accident. Even his clothes matched what his family had described him wearing when he disappeared. But the official investigation had concluded that Carlos had probably died in the desert, victim of exposure or violence. His body was never found, but the case was closed after 2 years. No evidence of successful border crossing. No indication that he had made it to the United States alive. I contacted his family through a church in their hometown. The conversation was heartbreaking. His mother had never stopped hoping he would return. His father had died 5 years earlier, still waiting for news about his missing son. They had prayed every day for 15 years, holding on to the slim possibility that Carlos was alive somewhere in America. I could not tell them about my encounter. How do you explain that their son had been trapped in a time loop, sealed in a compartment that existed only in the space between life and death? How do you describe meeting a ghost who did not know he was dead? Instead, I told them I was researching cold cases for a documentary about border tragedies. They shared photos and memories, painting a picture of a young man desperate to find work and support his family. Carlos had been smart and ambitious, fluent in English, with dreams of starting a business once he earned enough money in America. The photos confirmed what I already knew. The Carlos the first had met was exactly the same age, wearing exactly the same clothes as the Carlos who had disappeared in 2008. 15 years had passed in the world, but he had remained frozen in the moment of his death. I kept driving my regular routes, but I was more careful now about strange noises and unusual compartments. I started talking to other drivers about unexplained encounters on border runs. Most guys just laughed it off, but I found a few who had similar stories. One driver from El Paso told me about finding fresh footprints around his trailer after crossing at the Bridge of the Americas, even though his cargo area was sealed and locked. Another guy described hearing voices speaking Spanish from inside his empty trailer during a run from Tijuana to Los Angeles. The voices stopped when he pulled over to investigate, but he found scratches on the interior walls that had not been there during his pre-trip inspection. A pattern emerged from these stories. Drivers who hauled freight across the border sometimes became unwilling carriers for more than just cargo. They transported the unresolved mysteries of people who had died trying to reach America, souls trapped in the machinery of international commerce. The smuggling trade leaves more victims than official statistics ever record. Young men and women die in the desert, suffocate in sealed compartments, or simply vanish into the vast machinery of human trafficking. Their families never know what happened. Their bodies are never found. Their stories become part of the collective tragedy that haunts the borderlands. But sometimes, under the right conditions, those stories reach out to the living. A driver who cares enough to investigate strange noises might become a temporary bridge between worlds, offering help that comes 15 years too late but still matters in ways that transcend time and death. Carlos found someone who would listen, someone who would remember his name and honor his story. For one night, he was not just another missing person statistic. He was a human being with dreams and fears and a family that loved him. That may not be enough to bring him peace, but it is something. I still drive the border routes between Mexico and Texas. I still hear strange noises and investigate unexplained scratches. And sometimes, just sometimes, I find traces of the people who died trying to cross into a better life. They are still out there, sealed in compartments that exist between then and now, waiting for someone to hear their voices and remember their names. The border is haunted by more than just politics and economics. It is haunted by the dreams of people who never made it home. Carlos Mendez was 19 years old when he died in 2008, trapped in a smuggler's compartment that became his tomb. But for one night in 2023, he was alive again, drinking water and sharing stories and holding on to hope that someone would help him find his way. I carry that hope with me on every mile I drive. Because sometimes the living owe a debt to the dead, and the only way to pay it is by remembering their names and honoring their stories. The road between life and death runs both ways, and every driver who crosses the border carries passengers they never knew were there. Another drive, another story, but some passengers never leave. This is Midnight Whispers. Thank you for traveling with us. Subscribe and hit the bell so you're always the first to hear the next story in the dark. Share your location or your own haunted road in the comments. We're collecting maps of the unseen. Until next time, drive safe and don't look back too soon.